All right, this is my video for 3C, my growth goal analysis, kind of going through it. So in my 3 areas, there was growth in all of them. There's definitely still room for improvement. I learned a lot through just the process of giving surveys and the actual interactions during the surveys. The questions they ask while taking the survey gives you information already. And just noticing student patterns and behaviors while taking a survey. Some students rush through it and circle and move on, and you kind of have to go back and try to get them to slow down. You also have to kind of be aware that some students are anxious, even though they're anonymous, that they're going to upset you or they don't want to not know. So that whole process I found fascinating, just in general. But to go through these 3 growth goals, my first one was chunking content. I was so glad that I did this. I was also glad that I had kind of a very short unit before a longer unit, because I tested some things out and the first things I tried did not go super well. With chunking content, we have workbooks in this county. I'll just show you. They look like this. They are very long and there's a lot on the page. The pages also, I don't know if you could kind of just tell through that quick flip through, but a lot of them look very similar between pages. So this, handing them to students for 6, 8, 10 weeks gets really confusing. And then as we go through the content and add stuff, they're also getting supplemental stuff added in or things taken out. So we're skipping pages and we're adding worksheets, and it just is not chunked. So I chunked the content. I saw positive growth. My first mean was 2.28 and it went to 3.53. The kids were the most verbal just during this process of changing things about like, oh, we're not doing workbooks. Oh, I can find it. My work completion went up significantly. It was easier to get students work if they were absent. It was easier to get students work if they were in our ISS, our ALC, if they were in trouble and downstairs. So I saw work completion go up. I also I made my own slides for that unit. Students requested the ability to have slides, especially if there was anything transferring. So there was a couple of the times where we had vocabulary and things like that they were writing in their packets. So they had access to the slides the whole time. And every day on the slides, they said the labels that were in the packet. It had a checklist of what we were doing that day. Sometimes it showed them where they got a break. And I just watched the way our class flowed transform through that process. So that was one where I was like, absolutely, I saw this go really well. The biggest area that I still need growth in is pre-assessments. I think I have a lot of big plans for next year always. I did a couple pre-assessments. I did mainly one main pre-assessment. And I need to do more skill-based pre-assessments so that I can say, like, we've got this skill or we don't. I did a little more conceptual pre-assessments for this one. So we had a speeches and the part that goes along with the whole kind of lesson with Cesar Chavez. So I asked them more about like, what do you know about this topic, building background information, what makes an effective speech, those kinds of things. And I asked them before and then after the unit. And then with the Tell Your Story, Voices of Slavery, I also asked them more conceptual. What is literacy? Why is literacy important? What's a personal narrative? Those kinds of things. So I definitely have a lot of growth to do in the area of pre-assessments and utilizing pre-assessments for good data to inform my teaching. The next one was providing students scales and rubrics. And this was one that just like, I had to challenge my own, like, I tell my kids all the time, like growth mindset. And I definitely had like a static mindset. I'm like, I fill out rubrics and I give them to them. And it's not that I don't want them to have the information of how to get all the points or even what is excellent and what needs to be tweaked or shows that they still have some growth to do. It's just that it wasn't in my practice. So the chunking and the skills and rubrics were really paired in a lot of ways, because in every single packet that I made to address the chunking, I also added at the very bottom a rubric for them to score themselves. So if they turned it in without that, I handed it back and I said, nope, you go through every section and talk about that. One thing I noticed was that they did not, the first couple I did, they didn't know the point breakdown. So we actually did it together as a class, like I showed them. So just saying like this section is worth this amount of points is good for some things, but wasn't good for everything. So I learned that. And I liked the check boxes where students said, I did do this and it was complete, and it is like even things like it's legible and it's a complete sentence, things like that. So that helped them. I watched several of them check things and be like, oh, I didn't do that, and fix it. And their grades were a lot higher for that unit. Their participation was a lot higher for that unit. So that went really well. Proficiency scales was something I tried to have like a little mini lesson on, and I think they got it. We talked about it more in context of the EOG, because they just get that boom, not proficient. So what does proficient mean? What does exceeding expectations look like? I would love to give them, we had already finished most of our big papers for the year. So I would love to give them a rubric proficiency scale on writing specifically next year. But I definitely have the most growth to do in that area for proficiency scales and showing them those. I had already been doing daily learning targets. Every day they knew where it was. Our school, it was really focused on learning targets this year, even to the point where we have teachers come in every once in a while and just ask kids, like, what's the learning target today? So I knew that my kids mainly knew where it was on the board. We read it every day. I just deepened that practice. So I spent more time. I bolded and underlined words. Sometimes we defined words. And then there were some that I was like, okay, this is the big goal, but here are the steps. And that was good because we got to talk about like, okay, I want to run a marathon. Do I go out and run 26 miles tomorrow? No, maybe I start with 1 mile, but we're heading towards the goal. So we talked about kind of the big idea versus the piece of it. But I was not surprised to see growth in that goal. It went from a 2.2 to a 3.48. We did daily warm-ups where the kids everyone wrote down the warm-up. Everybody wrote down the learning target. Before, it was like, sometimes they'd write it on their whiteboard desk. Sometimes I would tell them to turn and talk. But this was systematic. Every day I come in, and my 2 processes are, am I ready for class? I have the checklist for that already on the wall. And then did I write down my learning target before we talked about it? And the engagement with that spiked. So that was already one I was like, oh, I'm doing okay. And I deepened. And then the skills and rubrics were something new that I added. I also sent that stuff home to parents, especially if a student struggled, to be like, hey, your student had this as the guide, and this is the work they provided. So let's work together to talk about like integrity of our work. And that was a really good tool for communicating with parents. The last one was providing opportunities for students to talk about themselves. This is one that a lot of us in the cohort worked on, but it was really interesting to see how we worked on it in different ways. I thrive on building relationships with kids. I am a teacher because of it, and I love middle schoolers. So I was like, I'm great at this. And then the great and like humbling thing about all 43 of the growth categories is that when they break down some of these skills, like when you read the skill, I'm like, I do that. And then you read the breakdown, you're like, do I do that? So this is one of those ones where I was a little bit like, not systematically. And that word came up so much in the scales. Like, I'm like, I do that informally, but do I do it systematically? So this one was cool because I asked the students how they wanted to be interacted with. I can guess, I think I know based on some things, but lots of the kids had mentioned that in the beginning of the year we did a this or that. The first couple weeks of school, just as I got to know them, and they really liked that. We did favorites. We did debate questions, like, is a hot dog a sandwich? Does a straw have one hole or two? Is water wet? And those kind of were fun debates, which are not necessarily to talk about themselves, but more so their opinions. And then I had a list of questions where anytime we had a few minutes at the end of class or the library days, I would start with one of these. Tell me about a time you got embarrassed. Tell me about your best Christmas you've ever had. Tell me about your pet. Oh my gosh, we spent 2 weeks on pets. So that was this informal relationship building, but I'm going to give time to this in class, even just a second. That this or that takes, they do, this is one, that is two, like quick, and we're moving on. Then because of the content of the units that we were talking about, there was a lot of opportunities for me to infuse in the bell ringer, opportunities for them to connect to something. So we're talking about Tell Your Story, Frederick Douglass. We talked a lot about, like, do you have family history passed down, stories that your parents have passed down to you, even if they're not cultural necessarily, other than like something different than American culture. Like, do you have stories that just like at Christmas time or your uncle always tells or whatever? We talked about hardship. Have you ever had to be brave? Have you ever had to learn something completely new that felt really difficult for you to learn? Did you ever feel like someone was against you and didn't want you to succeed? How did you overcome that? We talked a lot about perseverance and even just literacy. Like, what piece of your story do you think would be worth writing down? What could future generations learn if middle schoolers today wrote down their life? So things like that really came into play with that growth goal. The one thing I did not do enough of, because I did it in my impact time. Impact time is like a study hall-ish 30 minutes we have in our day. I did career exploration during that. I actually pulled in my our school counselor, Miss Avery. She came in and did a thing where for a couple days with them, and then I did a few more lessons, but I only see part of my students for impact time. So I definitely could infuse more careers, and that's something I'd like to highlight throughout the year better. Like, what about careers where we don't think of reading and writing necessarily specifically, like an author? What about careers that don't have that? What about even careers we associate with math? Where does literacy come in? And highlighting different people's careers, probably real people in my life and some of my coworkers' lives. Kind of doing like, almost like when you bring the parent to, like, parent shows their job off when they're in like kindergarten or whatever. Maybe that's just a sitcom thing, but kind of highlighting like, hey, like, this is what some of you could do later, and you will need literacy. So anyways, I think that all three growth areas, the growth I saw was good. Sometimes I thought the growth was a little bit like, not unwarranted, but I was like, oh, I have further to grow in this than you're saying. But they were all very receptive. They also just did significantly better the second time I gave them a survey, because at this point they had rubrics. We had practice with doing that kind of stuff. We had poll everywheres, so they had seen that format. And then the second time they were like, yeah, we got it. So I was happy with the growth, and I'm actually excited to do this process with a lot of the other 43 elements. So that is my analysis on the data.